Today we're hosting what I think will be an interesting discussion. I'm joined today by Adrianne Jones-Alston, who is a criminal justice activist in Virginia, and he is working on bringing back to center stage, I would say, events that took place in Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia. And we're also joined by my friend Allen Hornblum, who is the author of the 1998 book, Acres of Skin, which I would argue is the book that brought the situation in Holmesburg Prison to the public consciousness. And he's remained very active on the issue since 1998. And we'll be talking about perhaps some of the new developments of why this is something that we should all be bringing our attention towards again. So thank you both for joining me.
Good to be with you.
So Adrianne, can you perhaps begin by explaining your background, who you are, and then we could talk a little bit about who your father was and use that sort of as a segue to talk about some of the events that took place in Holmesburg Prison.
Okay, I'm Adrianne Jones-Alston, and I am the daughter of Leodus Jones, who was one of the participants in the Holmesburg Prison experiments. My father was an activist in Philadelphia, as everyone knows, according to the book. But how I became involved is I was also an activist starting back in 2003. And that was after serving a prison sentence myself for a nonviolent offense. I was part of a reentry group where I would go back and forth and go to meetings after I exited, accomplish an apartment and a job, and help others. There's where I found my passion for helping others. So to fast forward that a little bit, my father, who was already an activist, so I'm tying us two together as, you know, relating to the work. My father passed away almost 4 years ago now. When he passed away, I was contacted by a professor of a university who was doing some was interested in creating a podcast production pertaining to Dr. Albert Kligman. And he said to me, he contacted me through the memory page that I set up on Facebook in honor of my father after his death. And he contacted me and he said to me, when we finally got connected to the telephone, hey, I'm doing some history on Dr. Albert Kligman and experiments at Holmesburg, but every time I turn a corner, there's your father. I want to know, what I want to know from you is a little bit of history about what it was like to be his child. And that was like, I'm like, to be his child. I know my father, you know, it's not big to me like it is out there because I was younger. You know, he was big, but he wasn't as big to me as he was to society because I wasn't out there experiencing what he was doing because I was very young when he started. And my parents separated. I was a young age. I did visit with my father. But I didn't get the fullness of his work, the fullness of it until he passed away. So, they asked me some questions and things started coming back. And I was like, hey, that was doing some big stuff, making some big moves and making some accomplishments. And I learned a lot of things that I didn't know. So that got me interested in carrying his legacy on. So I talked to a couple of people and I decided to start a campaign because I learned that Penn had not at that point apologized. My father fought for that for decades. They never gave reparations. They never acknowledged some of the inmates that were damaged, you know, throughout these experiments. I then learned that a lot of people made a lot of money off the sweat of their backs, and I would remember my father's injuries, you know, what I experienced at the home. So I felt compelled to step up to the plate and carry that torch. Well, and that's how I got here.
And to your point about your father being fairly well known in a lot of circles, for instance, in 2018, when he passed away, the Philadelphia Inquirer had a pretty lengthy piece about his life and photographs, and, you know, he was certainly well covered at the time, his death.
Yes, he was. And I also had a couple articles published in the Philadelphia Inquirer as it pertained to the my campaign for justice. As you know, what I mean by that is I put a couple articles out about University of Penn and my opinions. I also had an article in your magazine as well. I've participated in several podcast productions, Zoom meetings. I'm scheduled to speak at a university. So and it's a lot of information out there about my father, and I'm still finding things. So it's it's a lot of information. And what I don't hear a lot about what he did was the voter registration at the prisons. He went into the prisons to make sure that the ones who were still qualified to vote can vote, and took those voted, documents that they needed to register. He did a lot of work. My father did a lot of community outreach. There's a lot out there for him, yes. About him, I mean, yes.
So, Alan, Adrianne has sort of provided a close look on her father. We're going to talk a little bit more about, as you talked in the MW magazine piece, about sort of the way that his experiences at Holmesburg may have influenced his family life. But Alan, perhaps you can, for those who aren't as familiar with the events at Holmesburg and your book, perhaps you can give a little bit of a summary. And for me, what I think is so poignant is actually what you chose for the title, Acres of Skin, what Albert Kligman meant when he said that, and sort of perhaps that's a place to set the scene.
Well, Eric, it's a long, ugly story, because what we're talking about here is really the underbelly of American medical research. We're talking about the use of marginalized people, in this specific case, prisoners, those behind bars and high walls, who were used repeatedly as human guinea pigs for medical experimentation. And acres of skin is not my phrase. It's a phrase that Albert Kligman used often to describe his access to thousands of downtrodden individuals who were in prison behind walls, and that he had gained access to the prison and influenced the leadership of the prison to allow him to come in and make the prison an adjunct of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, where from 1951 to 1974, he had full sway in the cell blocks of the House of Correction, Holmesburg Prison, and the detention center. You can easily and safely argue that what took place at Holmesburg and the other two prisons made Philadelphia the largest human experimentation factory in post-war America. I have not found anything that rivals it with regard to the number of years, the number of test subjects, and the number of protocols. It's just off the charts.
One thing that you alluded to, Alan, that I think you might want to bring into focus for those listening is the length of the experimentation. And obviously, as we've talked about before, we recently had the anniversary of the revelations of the Tuskegee syphilis study, which was even longer, at approximately 4 decades. But again, this wasn't going on for 6 months.
That's right. There was much human experimentation in 20th century America. Regrettably, the bulk of it happened after the creation of the Nuremberg Code, which American jurists set up and established. But as I argue in my lectures at various medical schools and colleges, it's almost as if the ship that carried those 10 principles of the Nuremberg Code sunk somewhere between Greenland and the United States, because many universities practiced an unethical form of experimentation and medical research, where they were much attracted to these institutions that held downtrodden, powerless people, whether they were children with intellectual disabilities, or they were individuals with physical or mental maladies, or mental hospitals. That is where doctors during the 20th century went to perfect their elixirs for various diseases and conundrums that were out there. And they saw these people, in this specific case, prisoners, as that intervening layer between guinea pigs and monkeys and humans. So when Kligman went from the University of Pennsylvania in West Philadelphia to Northeast Philadelphia, where he saw hundreds and thousands of inmates behind the walls, right away, his entrepreneurial side of his brain clicked in, and he decided, this is where I'm going to do medical experiments. And regrettably, the leadership of the prison system gave him entree and let him do it from 51 to 1974. And as you said, nothing rivals it except for what took place in Tuskegee, which ran from 1932 to 1972. The Holmesburg experiments start while Tuskegee is underway, 1951, and it finally ends in 74, part of the aftermath of those Tuskegee revelations that you talked about earlier.
So I want to get Adrianne back involved in a second, but I just want to say one other thing. And Allen, this has always made an impression on me. And we discussed it the first time you and I met, which was doing a conversation much like this around this time, actually 4 years ago, but was this idea that the United States, the Allies, had just fought a world war against Germany. And in the years that would follow, the actions of Germany towards various populations there would become synonymous with evil incarnate. And then there was sort of this, oh my goodness moment where, as we look back on certain periods of American history, there was human experimentation going on here as well.
That is correct. And that is something that I bring out in my lectures. And it should be understood that what took place on H Block at Holmesburg and on blocks at Detention Center and the House of Correction, they were pretty bad. They were pretty horrendous, especially when you consider it's the American jurists and American army that put the Nazi doctors on trial. Our experiments in America in no way rivaled what took place at Dachau and Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. But I would like to underscore that based on the first principle of the Nuremberg Code, which clearly states if an individual does not have free will and free choice, if he's in a confined or coercive environment, he should not be part of a medical experiment. That is the first principle of the code. Most people emphasize the first 5 or 6 words being informed consent, but that first principle goes on to underscore the environment that that decision is made.
Correct.
And I would submit that anybody who's locked up in a prison behind razor wire or high walls, who cannot leave when they want to, is in a confined, coercive environment and should not be part of a medical experiment, because there's too much pressure on that person to do what he thinks the purveyors of the institution want them to do. So you were right, there was not a gun put to the head of the inmates, but when you're locked up on a cell block, and the only way that you have to earn any money in the jail that you want for commissary, or you want to send to your wife, or you want to maybe pay your own bail, you take part in things that you would not normally do on the street.
Well, I think that's an important point, because we talk about things like consent in the abstract, and as people listening may or may not know, Allen actually worked in the prisons as a literary instructor, and that's how he or witness.
That's exactly right. I'm one of the few people around today, even though I look like you in my early to mid 20s and 30s. I've got a few more years and decades on that, but I did observe those experiments from the first day I walked into the jail, because what you have to imagine is going through a prison, which is shocking enough, but then you see scores and scores of inmates with adhesive tape and bandages on their chest, their arms, their head. And you wonder to yourself, is this institution that unsafe? Were they having knife fights on a cell block or gang wars in the prison? No, it was a large scale clinical trial, many of them that were coordinated for some of the largest pharmaceutical companies and drug companies and all sorts of private outfits were coming, as well as Kligman's own enterprising experiments that he was doing for profit or just as intellectual curiosity.
So, Adrian, could you talk about some of the experiences that your father had and some of the sort of specific experiments that he faced?
Experiments he participated in, you saying?
Yeah, sort of what experiences he had in the prison and what experiments he was party to.
My father, when he entered prison, as the stories told for many of them, he didn't have much money. I remember him calling home. Well, my mother, no, I don't remember him calling home. I remember my mother telling me he's called home and told her about these experiments. And he was of sound mind then, but she begged him not to do it, and he did it anyway. Um, when my first experience of seeing, what my father went through was when he came home, and I think I accidentally saw his back, and I was a little kid then. My father took off his shirt, had his shirt off. I walked in a room and it scared me, and I ran. But when I looked at him, he had all these sores, Uzi sores was on his back, and it just weirded me out. And I screamed and ran, and I told my mother that my dad was turning into something. I was a kid, and you know how kids think. I was about 5 or 6, somewhere around that. And then my father told us he did something in prison, and it made him sick. Uh,
Well,
Go
you're
ahead.
a kid, and even now, those of us, myself or other people who see the cover of Allen's book, which features an inmate who has some of these marks from having participated in the experiments, and it is gristly and it is hard to look at. It's
It
hard.
was horrible. The sword started from the back of the nape of his neck and went down as far as I could see, where your pants start at your back, and the whole back was covered. And later on, it took on the appearance of almost like a leopard's coat. You had blotches of light skin, and that was his permanent appearance of his back. Those were his permanent scars. They never went away.
And in the article you wrote at MW, you indicated that perhaps some of the experiences he had had in prison, particularly with the experimentation, when he got back, everyone else around him, by extension, sort of bore the brunt of that as well.
Are you talking about his behavior change? My father, it was probably 2 or maybe 3 times he went back in, and I'm assuming now he couldn't get it together, but he went away again. And when he came back, I had to think about that. He came back. That's when the mental change came in. He was withdrawn. He was very defensive, towards my mother and other family members. It was always an argument. It was always an argument or a debate, and at times it became violent. I witnessed and probably was in the middle of many fights. I'm talking about physical fights where it was blood drawn and clothes thrown off, and it ran me crazy. I mean, between the sores, and I was just determined as a kid that he just turned into something, and I stayed away from him for a while. And I was hurt by that because I was a daddy's girl. Before that, he took us to the parks and participated in little softball games. We ain't know what we was doing, but we was having fun with daddy. You know what I'm saying? I would sit on the front stoop and wait for my father to come home. To backtrack that, he was employed at a factory, and at this factory, this was before incarceration. He used to bring home boxes of dresses for our birthdays, big frilly, beautiful dresses for me and my sister, suit for my brother, Easter stuff, and you know what I'm saying. And I would sit on that stoop and wait for my daddy to come home because I knew he had a piece of candy or he had something or just a hug. He would put me on his shoulder and we'll go back up the street. I'll run, fall, and I remember all that good stuff, and that just went away, and that shattered my world. But what was even more devastating was when they separated, because I didn't care how sick he was my father. You know what I'm saying? So that destroyed me in a way I can't even describe. I kind of withdrew from a lot.
Eric, if I could step in here and augment what Adrian is saying,
Sure.
your audience should understand that there were not just skin patch tests with different concoctions and elixirs and wart virus and herpes simplex and all of these put on somebody's body. There was also a period of years, close to 10 years, from the mid-60s to about 72, 73, when the U.S. Army Chemical Corps came into Holmesburg, brought in 3 trailers that were between 2 cell blocks, and they started doing chemical warfare studies for the Army that were initially done at the Edgewood Arsenal Army Base in Maryland. But the concoctions, specifically LSD, were knocking out the soldiers who were the test subjects then for an extended period of time. And the Army needed more information and another site to do these experiments. And everybody in the field of clinical trials at that time in America knew about Albert Kligman, University of Pennsylvania, and Holmesburg. And so like the others, like R.J. Reynolds and like Dow Chemical Company, you had the U.S. Army coming to Kligman stating that we would like you to do a series of protocols for us, and we will give you this much money and so forth and so on. And the point I'm trying to get to in a roundabout way is that a lot of these chemical concoctions did significant damage at the time and for a long running period to the psyches of these men. In fact, it was so bad that many of the men who were used as test subjects were given a little card that would be placed on their prison jumpsuit stating, "Please disregard my behavior. I am a participant in the University of Pennsylvania U.S. Army studies. And if I am looking a bit haphazard to you, please take me back to their cell block." The point being that some of these men were so mentally deranged at the time that they could not remember their names, where they were at, why they were in prison, where they lived, who their loved ones were. And some of the ramifications of these lasted a long time. And you have a number of men who told me that from then on, their modus operandi changed as criminals. So that for early on, they may have been boosters, retail theft, stealing items from department stores or supermarkets. But after those experiments, they started to use a gun and stick up convenience stores and banks and other things like that. And if the people don't believe me, they can try to procure a film that I made with a colleague called Acres of Skin, the documentary. And one of the real highlights of that film are the interviews that we did with many Holmesburg test subjects who talk about how, as Adrian said, they beat up their wives, they beat up their daughters, they beat up family members. Their whole personality changed because of very high levels of atropine, scopolamine, belladinoids, benzoates, all of this being done for the purposes of the U.S. Army to test what they needed or wanted to test in regard to the threat of the Soviet Union.
So you've indicated that it sort of became clear in a lot of circles that Holmesburg was the place to go to do these things in Maryland and other places.
Correct. There were entreaties by corporations down south. R.J. Reynolds wanted to test tobacco products. Dow Chemical wanted to test something particularly nasty that was affecting their factory workers. What it turned out to be dioxin, which is the backbone, the key ingredient of Agent Orange. That was first tested on Americans, tested in Philadelphia on prison inmates, where they gave Kligman a protocol and he put small pieces of dioxin on the faces and backs of prisoners. Never informing the inmates what it was or
Yeah.
what it could do to them.
Yeah.
And this was, very dangerous, toxic, carcinogenic material. Kligman never said no to anyone, as far as I'm aware. He was always interested in the intellectual challenge, certainly interested in the remuneration he was paid. And so to this day, as far as I know, that experiment for Dow Chemical using dioxin is the only time it's ever been used on the American public. And that was as a clinical trial. But there are many other examples. And although the citizens of Philadelphia didn't know about it, the political structure didn't really know about it or care, Philadelphia became the go-to place to do serious clinical trials because of the reputation built up by Albert Kligman, University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and the Holmesburg Prison.
So, Alan, obviously, you're somebody who has written a lot about not only what took place there, but also has gained some insights into Albert Kligman, the man. And can you just say a little bit about what he was like?
Well, I think in a very short phrase, you could call Kligman a medical buccaneer, in the sense that he was willing to stretch the boundaries of proper medical procedure and ethical studies. He didn't really care about any guidelines. He never either knew or cared about the Nuremberg Code. What he felt was best was best. And he was in an environment, the prison, where you can basically do whatever you want and the authorities will allow you to do it, which is part of the reason that Adrianne and I are now looking for, if this is the proper place to bring it up, the fact that we believe the city of Philadelphia, with the current mayor or the current city council, should do what Bill Clinton did in 1997, and that is come forth with an apology. Just as Clinton apologized for what the American government did to these Alabama sharecroppers, that the mayor of the city should do the same with regard to what was done to prisoners locked up behind bars and high walls in Philadelphia for basically a quarter century.
So I'm glad you brought that up. And this is perhaps the opportunity to talk about sort of what you two are looking for. Alan, I know there's been some success on the part of asking the University of Pennsylvania to take a closer look at their relationship with Dr. Kligman. So maybe it's a good opportunity for you to briefly say something about that.
Well, I'll go into a little bit of the background, as your viewers may be able to gauge and you've articulated. I've been on the case for a good many decades. I witnessed these experiments in the 70s. They always bothered me. I always expected a historian or an ethicist or a journalist to write the story. As the years and decades go by, and I'm now working in the Philadelphia Sheriff's Office, still not seeing a good book delineating the history of prisoners as guinea pigs, I decided to throw myself into the breach and do an extensive number of interviews with doctors and prisoners, do a full court search for documents, which I got from many different government agencies, that really showed the breadth of Kligman's initiative. And as I said, it was going on for 25 years, close to that. And an apology is due. And I think the city is we have to understand that the Tuskegee experiments took place in the backwoods of Alabama, a very unschooled, unsophisticated area. Here in Philadelphia, we have the third largest city in the nation at that time during the 50s and 60s. Powerhouse universities, Ivy League universities, major medical institutions. Nobody blew the whistle on what Kligman was doing, just as they did not blow the whistle on what was happening in Tuskegee over all those decades. It's just egregious in my mind that people either did not know or knew and were afraid to speak up. And so it is really time that the city own up to what they did. And we may want to argue the merits of reparations and how they should be structured, but certainly an apology is due, as well as to people like Adrianne, because as she said, she grew up in a household that sort of exploded and fell apart, not just due to the breadwinner going behind bars, but then being used as a human guinea pig and coming back home, not only with physical scars, but some serious mental problems as well.
So the specific request at this juncture is for the mayor of Philadelphia to make a public apology for the city's role in this going on. Can you talk about the extent to which city leadership at the time was aware of either the experiments taking place, the contents of the experiments, the potential lack of oversight to the experiments, there's sort of an epistemological question perhaps of to what degree did the city of Philadelphia, so the University of Pennsylvania, it seems as though they obviously would have had or ought to have had a lot more say in the specific procedures of what's going on. What did the city of Philadelphia know and not know?
That's a very good question. And to give you a good answer, I'd have to go into a great deal of depth and detail. And I know we don't have the time for it, but it basically comes down to that this area, medical research, was not on the front burner of anybody's stove. It was not on the radar screen. If somebody comes up with a new elixir that's going to solve a long-standing problem, the journalistic community would come there and address it and talk about it and make a hero out of the individual who created it. But on a daily basis, there's not a lot of talk and discussion. The City Council of Philadelphia, 17 members, didn't have particular interest in medical research. And sadly, they didn't have a great deal of interest in what was happening in the Philadelphia prison system. Prisons are one of those areas where elected officials, they don't see voters, they don't see sophisticated people, they don't politic there trying to win their support or vote or whatever. Many of them, certainly at that time, did not vote at all. So they just wrote it off. And the city wrote it off with not much care or interest. So it allowed Kligman and Penn and the superintendent of the system to let this major city operation run based on their decision-making. Just think about it. Thousands and thousands of people are being used as guinea pigs. Money is transpiring between some of these major entrepreneurs, corporations, and Kligman, and the city leadership doesn't know anything about it.
It's more a question that they were negligent in not being on top of what was going on.
Absolutely, without a doubt, that's what it was.
Yeah.
It was, you could argue that it was a less sophisticated people. There's not a lot of emphasis on ethics in medical schools. There still isn't to this day, and I could give you more examples of that. But this goes on almost as if it was taking place in the Klondike or in Siberia. The leadership doesn't know about it and doesn't much care.
So just to be clear, Holmesburg Prison was a Philadelphia
county jail. It was a county jail holding anywhere between 1,000 and 1,500 people for most of the 20th century.
Philadelphia, and that's
correct.
Why you're asking the
And there's two other prisons that were in a stone's throw of Holmesburg: the House of Correction and the Detention Center. And inmates in all three would be used as test subjects, because Kligman initially did the experiments at Holmesburg, but then as his operation expanded and more companies are coming to him who want protocols done, he expands into the other two facilities. So it is a major corporate financial initiative. And in fact, there were people at the University of Pennsylvania who knew about it, and they may have been professors in sociology or history or certainly medicine, and they probably had some qualms about what was going up at the prison, but nobody rang the bell. Nobody spoke out. Nobody said anything, because they didn't want to upset what seemed to be making money for the university and certainly pleasing Albert Kligman. So it's a very sad commentary that even in one of the most sophisticated cities in the Western world and in America, this is going on hourly and daily, and nobody seems to care.
So, Adrianne, are you optimistic at this juncture that an apology from the city of Philadelphia is something that might be likely to take place?
I believe it. I believe it will. I believe it. Yeah, I believe it will because of the other organizations that are owning up to their part that they played in unethical practices. Look at the Tuskegee study. I just spoke with one of their descendants, and not only did they get that apology, but organizations have came through that said, "Hey, we participated in this, and we're sorry. We made a lot of money, and it wasn't right." And it's okay. Some ownership has to take place here. Retin-A is a great product. It helped a lot of people in the dermatology world. People are benefiting today, but a lot of people were damaged in the process. And I'm speaking for my family, we were damaged down to the generations.
Were you surprised the University of Pennsylvania has taken steps, as I understand, to reduce the sort of honors, I suppose, they would give to the late Dr. Kligman?
Kind of, sort of, but some of that, I don't know, but the pressure, evidently what is going on here is a powerful process. They're not going to do it just because an old black girl came and said, "Hey, you hurt my daddy," or people writing articles. It had to be a lot more pressure applied there to cause them to do, and some of that was lip service. They said what they were going to do or what they were willing to do, but I would like to do a follow-up to see how much of that have actually been done.
So you mentioned, or I think it's been alluded to, perhaps the idea of there being some sort of compensation, perhaps to the living survivors of Tuskegee, or perhaps to the degree that harm can be demonstrated to perhaps surviving descendants. Could you talk a little bit about what you had in mind, and maybe perhaps some of the challenges that would go along with that, if that's indeed something that you would favor?
Well, first of all, the apology. The apology is what I want to hear. My father's lifespan wasn't long enough to hear Penn say, "Hey, we apologize for what we done," and he fought for that for decades. I was blessed to hear it. Now the apology came. Now I would like, as far now we hear reparations a lot, and reparations is not necessarily money. It'll be nice, Hey, his skin is on them jars in them stores. My father's skin is in those pharmaceutical companies, still making money. His skin is there, so why fold your pockets if you got to part with some of it for the people that were harmed? That would be nice, but that's not necessarily what I'm talking about, because I know that's a long fight. When you try to get people's money, you want to get a big fight. I would like a seat at a table to talk with some decision makers that can make a difference, and we can come together and try to get some trust between the medical professionals and the Black and brown communities, because we are lacking in that. It was hard for the companies to say, "Hey, you need a COVID vaccine." People were dying and dropping like flies, and people still didn't care. We don't trust y'all.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Adrianne, because you and I actually spoke about that via email around the time of your article. And I know, I think it's okay to say publicly, but I know you decided to get the COVID vaccine. And maybe could you talk about a little bit of your thought process there and the hesitancy? And Alan, I know you have been involved with various efforts to encourage Black populations in Philadelphia to take the COVID vaccine. But Adrianne, maybe you could talk about, sort of, as somebody whose father had this experience, and I know you were very, at first, a little concerned about the vaccine too.
I was very concerned about it because of not what I heard or something I read, is because what I saw in my own house. How my father was affected by something and somebody that was supposed to be trusted. So that followed me right on up from that age, right on up to the COVID vaccine and throughout life. Why? And I had to look, and I literally look in the mirror. What is wrong with you? Why are you trusting this vaccine? But I suffer with, I have heart disease, and I have COPD. So I paid attention to the people that got the COVID vaccine, and a lot of them I knew, and I was like, hey, they still living, but I would rather be safe than sorry. The vaccine is not killing anyone. So if I got sick, I might need that extra help. So I had to make a decision here. Am I going to trust? I'm going to trust them because they can't get away with all that stuff they did to daddy in prison. There's just too many people watching them now. So they're not going to, do that again. I went back and forth with myself, about it, but I had to make a decision where I would rather be safe than sorry.
Right.
We came
If
a
I could
long
jump
way.
in, if I could jump in, Eric.
Yeah.
There is a well-known distrust and distaste by African Americans towards doctors and hospitals and certainly clinical trials. The medical community is always bemoaning the fact that they can't get African Americans to participate in clinical trials. Well, there's a good reason for that. And one of the key reasons, of course, is Tuskegee. The other are incidents like Holmesburg, where African Americans were used as flotsam and jetsam for all sorts of unethical and dangerous studies. And that stuff seeps to the bone and continues to resonate from one person to another, from one generation to another. And now the medical community may be hopefully recognizing the damage that they've done in the past and trying to address that. I know I've had discussions with Adrianne where she would like to be some sort of educator or intervening layer between the medical community and residents of the community, so that, the word goes out that some of these doctors and some of these hospitals can be trusted. They're not all like Kligman. They're not all like the doctors who were down there in Macon County, Alabama. It's going to be a long uphill slog, but that's what has to be done. But a lot of the resistance is due to these major horrendous examples of medical abuse that have taken place over the generations in this country.
Yes.
I have two questions sort of as we get to the end of our discussion. But the first is, I think you've indicated you're looking for an apology. I guess any apology is better than no apology, but are you hoping for sort of a meeting with the mayor, perhaps with descendants and survivors? I know, for example, Alan, I've met, I believe, Yusuf Abraham, who has come to various...
Yusuf Anthony,
who has come to various lectures you've given. Are you imagining sort of a meeting with the mayor?
well, I think that would be very good. In fact, that's what Clinton did back in '97. Herman Shaw and maybe one or two other survivors. They're all dead now, the Tuskegee men, but in '97 there were still 2 or 3 alive, and they were at that White House event. And I think Adrianne could coordinate such an event here in Philadelphia, where Mayor Kenny or City Council President Clark would have the few survivors that are still around, as well as people like Adrianne who witnessed it as children and know how that negative experience really impacted their lives and that of the family.
And has there also been some talk about an event at Holmesburg Prison?
Yes. I'm organizing. I'm in the process of organizing a visual to honor those who were participants in the Holmesburg Prison experiments. Those who passed away and those who are still, around. I've been campaigning around, asking around, getting descendants together, other people who are interested in the community, other organizations. So I'll be getting a date soon, and anyone interested can find out exactly when that date's going to be. Of course, between me and I'll let Allen Hornblum know, but also I set up a page in honor of my father on Facebook in memory of Leodus Jones. Carries a lot of information about the events that'll be coming up.
Last question. Adrianne, you had mentioned early in this discussion that you had first done some activism in the early 2000s when I suppose you were first released from prison. Can you just talk a little bit about the sort of advocacy you've done
Yes.
those days,
Yes.
and sort of what you've been trying to help people do?
I part of my advocacy in the earlier days was I was part of a reentry group, and we went with probation and parole, of the city where I was under probation, and we went back to the prison, and on the platform that I was presenting, I encouraged other women to, just get focused, what you expect, and how you can make this work for yourself. So I did that. I facilitated groups of other probationers as provided by the space was provided by probation and parole. I went to various places and I spoke to other people about, re-entry and what to expect when you're released from prison. I've also, right now, presently, I'm working with a halfway house facility who houses right now probably about 30 people coming out of the system. And what I do, my job is to be the vehicle between probation and parole and the sheriff's department in Hampton, Virginia, and the probation and parole in Newport News, Virginia. They call me and ask me, do we have any bed space? I then take the information and I connect them with the halfway houses so that these people can be housed. So that's part of the outreach that I do right now.
Yeah, so it sounds like obviously you now have some years under your belt in for this activism here. So I want to thank you both for speaking with me. Allen, always good to see you and to hear about sort of at this point your decades of quest of addressing what happened at Holmesburg Prison, because I suppose the book obviously appeared in 1998, but this idea had been percolating in your head since you saw it probably 20 years before, not to mention, as you've described in previous interviews, the rather arduous process you had of securing publication for that book. So this has been a very lengthy process.
Well, I want to thank you, Erich, for having the interest in this subject. Not everybody does. And that's part of the problem, that the folks that perpetuate the problem were the best of us, and they were using often the least of us as their guinea pigs. And that is a formula that can do a lot of damage, and the general public doesn't really pay attention to. So when I come across a journalist, either electronic or written or what have you, it shows me they're really on the ball and are, have a conscience with regard to what should and should not take place in a progressive, advanced society.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And I also want to say thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great to see you both, and we'll certainly see how things unfold in both this effort on behalf of the apology and see this potential event at Holmesburg Prison, which sounds like a very interesting event. So thank you both. And
thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay.